Hi, I'm Mark Rossano, founder and CEO of C6 Capital Holdings, coming to you from Primary Vision Network. So today on the Econ Show, we're gonna have our 5 shows instead of last week we did 4. And in the first segment, we want to look at how does the world react to these rising global geopolitical tensions. You know, we're going to talk about Israel, Gaza. We're going to talk about Ukraine and Russia. And then we want to look at defense spending and how that's going to shift over the next few years. And then how do we see growth and a lot of this, expectations for GDP expansion in the years to come. Then in the next segment, segment 2, we're going to look at Powell. You know, Powell was out today saying he essentially talked about a lot about rates, inflation, and realistically, we also want to look at how are retail sales doing, because we did get that data that came out. The third segment, we're going to look at inflation. You know, where does inflation go from here? Where is it now? Is it going to go? We've seen that reacceleration pick back up. Then in segment 4, we're going to talk about Europe's debt problems, because they continue to just get worse. And we want to look at, what does that mean for the ECB and different countries? And then when we look in segment 5, we're going to turn to, what was the most recent data that came out from China, and what does that mean for Chinese stimulus? And for those that have been following us, we've been saying that stimulus is probably not around the corner, given some of the data points that we've seen so far. So now jumping right into it, we want to look at, what is happening in terms of spending. So when we come to date, the top 6 countries by military expenditures from 1992 to 2022, you can see that the U.S. is clearly at the top of the list, with China expanding, India also expanding, and then obviously you have Saudi Arabia, Russia, UK. The main entities that you would expect kind of in this backdrop. And we're likely to see the U.S. start to increase some of that spending. So when we look at global military spending forecasts, you can see that there's an expectation of that to continue to go up. That's typically the case when you look at there's going to be a renewed push into R&D. There's going to be a renewed push into rare earths and ensuring supply lines, which again is going to be costly given where we sit. So I think at this point, we're going to continue to see a big push for that, and the U.S. is likely to continue to be at the forefront. We've already seen a lot of the NATO countries increase their expenditures, even above what they're supposed to in terms of NATO. For those that were there when Hillary and President Trump were debating, it was all about having NATO pay their fair share in all those countries that are involved, and you've seen that now come back and start to increase again, just because there is a growing conflict. When you look at what's happening in Ukraine, Russia, there is more pressure when you look at what's happening in Israel and Gaza. And a lot of these right now is the biggest thing is you don't want these situations to connect. And that's where you want to try to keep them separated. And as if you want to call the Truman Doctrine or policeman of the world, trying to keep them regional and not seeing the expansion abroad. So then when you look at, what has been sent to, from the U.S. into Ukraine, I've tried to explain it where, it's not just financial cash. There's a lot of it in terms of, assets and equipment, and there's different ways to file it. But when you consider the amount that we spend on the military and the amount of impact that this spending has had on Russia, you can make a good argument that it's money well spent in terms of trying to whittle down, Russian influence as well as Russian, military advancements. They did make a push. I forgot to put the charts in here. I'll put it in the Friday show. But when you look there, Russia did have an advancement. It stalled in several locations. They did break through the lines, which was beaten back. The unfortunate thing when you look at the loss of life, because there is no clear air superiority, we essentially have trench warfare, and you have this massive loss of life to essentially try to claim 3, 4, 5 mile tracts of land. And that's, again, a huge issue when you look at loss of life and that kind of wearing down of both sides, which is why there's such a big issue going forward. And it's unlikely to see any real breakthrough unless we start to see more air superiority and air involvement. When you look at R&D, it saw the largest increase in U.S. defense budget allocation, which isn't surprising when you look at how much things are being done online, when you look at PSYOPs, when you look at OSNet, when you look at a lot of the different pieces and spending. But at the same time, you also have to spend on protection against that, because when you look at Russia, when you look at China, North Korea, or Iran, when you look at a lot of these different players, they've also increased their PSYOPs, they've increased their cyber attacks. So not only, and again, the U.S. is by no means innocent in launching our own attacks, but you have to have protection. You have to have some of that backdrop. So when you start looking at operations and maintenance, when you look at research and development, we're seeing more and more getting pushed into that spending patterns. And I think this is a really good breakdown of how that's going to continue when you look at cybersecurity, cyberspace operations, cyber research and development. It's going to become a bigger component to where, the importance of this. And this is an interesting piece when you look at global internet shutdowns by country. A lot of this is done for control because they want to stop things from happening. A lot of it is done because of lack of power. And then some of them are forced to shut down based on cyber attacks. And again, these are things that you have to consider when you look at some of the key pieces along the military lines. And given the concerns abroad, the fact that we need our Navy to be where it is today and up to snuff, we're likely going to start to see additional spending in terms of maintenance operations to make sure that we can have this forward deployment, because it's expensive. The ships get worn down. There's salt water is not great on boats. You start to have issues, so you need a lot of maintenance, a lot of dry dock time, wet dock time, and then you have to make sure that everybody is properly equipped for what's to come. And because of our position, because of where we are in the world, we would be called upon to fight potentially multi-front wars and support multi-front advancements, and those are things that, again, you have to have a certain spending for. I don't want to get political on this, and I'm going to try to be as direct as possible. The evidence when you start looking at failed launches in Gaza, it's estimated that 6 to 10% of all rockets launched fail to reach their destination, and either fall within the Gaza Strip, fall within the ocean. The biggest concern, and this is the problem when you have people, rapidly trying to be front and center, is obviously the most recent bombing right near the hospital. When you looked at it, the comments were it was a bombing. Then as we went through it more and more, there was a simultaneous rocket attack, and there didn't appear to be a bombing or any type of IDF activity at the time. So the likelihood of it being a misfired rocket is highly likely. The crater is very small. It's not something that the Israeli military, in terms of just size, it's not something like that. If it was a JDAM or something bigger, you would have that level. The loss of life was extensive because it was in a courtyard. It was not a direct hit on the hospital. It was actually in a place that people were seeking shelter because they were either not being allowed to go south, they were stuck trying to get relatives. So again, it's a terrible situation, but again, war is hell. Like, there is nothing good that comes from war, but sometimes it is necessary to create a certain amount of stability. But it doesn't mean that you want to see innocent lives die. It doesn't mean you want to see civilian tragedy, as well as children that are no longer with us. So again, you have to have humanity on both sides, and it's all a matter of protecting that going forward. But also, showing what the issues are. Hamas has been terrible for the Palestinians. They have created atrocities on both sides of the border. And it's likely that we will see an advancement happening at the end of this week. They have gotten the green light. Biden was there. Jordan has. We've seen issues related to Jordan in terms of the call of our citizens, U.S. citizens, Israeli citizens, to leave Jordan, Lebanon, and the like. Because after everybody ran with the fact that Israel did the bombing on the hospital, which again, evidence is showing they didn't, but That was what was run with. The Muslim community united against it, and you saw a lot of different riots and protests in following it. So again, there's a lot happening here. There's a lot to unpack. These are things that you want to be cautious when you see things flying around social media. There was some saying that it was definitely Israel. There was some saying it was definitely Hamas. And again, it's all a matter of, what does the evidence show? What is the size of the crater? What was happening at that time? Were there IDF aircraft in the air? Was there a rocket attack at that exact moment? These are things that you have to look at, because unfortunately it is going to get worse, and it's likely going to get worse over the next couple of days. And it's just prepare for things that are going to happen, because both sides are going to try to play the publicity card, trying to make sure that the public opinion is on their side. Again, both sides do it. It's not just one side. You have to be, very agnostic and open about the fact that everybody's trying to play up, their side of the story. And that's where, ASNet, Signet, all these things come into play when you're looking at some of the different levels. So again, just stay vigilant. And hopefully, we can minimize as much civilian damage as we go forward. When we look at, again, all of these risk factors that we've talked about are going to create a stronger dollar. It's going to create a stronger demand for, treasuries. Not to say that treasuries aren't going to continue to rise in rates, but because we believe that yields are going to go up. But as that happens, you get more and more pressure. So emerging market country scorecard, vulnerability index. And again, it's just based on a lot of different levels, and it should be of no surprise that Colombia, Romania, Pakistan, Egypt, Hungary, have a huge amount of vulnerability to a strong dollar, to rising rates, because again, China, Taiwan, Indonesia, India, they have a certain amount of natural trade. They have a certain amount of, their own economy that they can withstand some of this. But when you start looking at current accounts, when you look at net foreign assets, external debt, public debt, that's where you start to see a rise of pressure. Obviously, China fails on the public debt side, the excess of bank loans. So it's not that everyone is agnostic to it, because everybody's going to be hit hard, but obviously some will be hit harder than others. Then when you look at the fragile five with emerging market heavyweights, when you start looking at India, Indonesia, Brazil, South Africa, Turkey, when you look at some of the issues there, it's going to be important to look at some of the taper tantrum issues that you had in 2013 and some of the problems that could have. So yes, on a vulnerability index, some of them aren't as bad, but you can get some outside influence, and that's where when we look at the 10-year and what that can do to the underlying market. And then when you start looking at the taper tantrum, and this is why it's important, you look at all of a sudden the taper tantrum, the India was under attack, Hungary, Brazil, Turkey. Things have improved in some of these areas, but it's important to recognize that things can turn sideways fairly quickly, and they've done things to try to cordon off and protect themselves from another type of taper tantrum, especially when you look at the how severe the rate of change has been in terms of the increase in rates, increase in yield, and this is some of the things that they tried to cordon off, but there's always something outside your control, and we've learned that from Adam Smith. We've learned that from the public, the markets, the way the invisible hand works. So it's always something where we do think that emerging markets are going to be under pressure, especially as the strong dollar is paired with a rise in rates. More importantly, the 10-year. Which is why when you start looking at the IMF, the IMF is much more optimistic about advanced economies, growth prospects versus others. Oxford Economics is just an example of one that is expecting a much slower world growth. For those that have been following us, we agree. We do think that advanced economies are going to be under, more strain, but we also think that that's, going to put the emerging markets under more strain. And I think that people are underestimating the amount of fiscal and monetary stimulus that even the emerging markets did, because they could, and it made sense during COVID to take that action. And that is going to leave them over levered to a lot of these different points, which I think is going to be a problem. Oxford Economics consensus and IMF GDP forecasts, obviously we think, and for those that have been following us, we think Eurozone is going to be in recession next year. We think the U.S. is going to maintain growth, but likely in the first 2 quarters, again, see some of this slowdown and be negative, start to see some advancement. We do think Japan has a much bigger problem, and Canada as well. So again, this is going to put that pressure on the underlying markets. And when you start looking at global service PMI, new export business, you can see that things are now firmly in contraction. Global service exports declined for the first time in 6 months in September, driven by steepening declines across the Eurozone and a renewed fall in the US. So again, services is a huge part of some of these developed industries, and we've already seen it now turn pretty steeply negative, and the trend continues lower, especially as you have the consumer slowing down. And as we talked about in the EIA show, a lot of global trade continues to be on a negative trajectory. Global rare earth element productions can continue to grow. We're going to need a significant amount of additional rare earths to keep the world moving. So again, this is going to be a big focal point, but it's important to look at, well, how are we going to get there? Because when you look at the charge-offs expected at the top 4 banks, it continues to grow. When you look at B of A, JP Morgan, Wells Fargo, Citigroup, there's a lot of problems that we don't see improving in the near term. And some of the reasons why we want to look at some of the issues, some of the problems that we expect to continue to see going forward. And this is going to be a problem overall. Then when you look at the short-term impact of various geopolitical events on gold price, typically, the flight to safety is real, and it's not just US dollar, it's not just yield treasuries, it's also gold. And gold typically does well in these levels. And it's interesting to see that as the geopolitical events age, you start to see a bit more of an opportunity where people kind of say, oh, it's going to be slow, or it's going to be over quickly. And I think the longer it goes, and the fact that it's less likely to be over quickly, all of a sudden you start to see a bit more of a rise in gold prices. Ownership breakdown on the U.S. Treasury markets, of foreign investors continue to be a huge piece of it. The Federal Reserve is going to continue to be on the shrinking side, but again, as foreign investors try to find some safety, even though I'm by no means saying the U.S. doesn't have its problems, it still is a safer part of the opportunity here. And that's where we're going to continue to see the foreign investment be kind of the bigger focal point going forward. Now, some of the key issues that we've seen and we continue to highlight is food inflation, which is obviously highly volatile. But for those that have got our C6 insights that we put out today, the October 19th, we talk about how food is getting worse. And even though it's come down on a year-over-year basis, it's like, well, on a month-over-month on that food CPI index, it's been a very strong, aggressive push. And every time we get this big surge in pricing, the floor is started at a higher level. And we continue to see, again, those pressure points continuing to mount. And, one of the things that we've talked about is how yields inherently have declined or flatlined. And it's all a matter of looking at both sides. So the corn market is expected to be higher, but when you look at wheat is supposed to be lower. This is, again, that balancing act where we have a growing population. We have a lot of geopolitical impacts slowing down the access or the movement of product. And again, that's hitting us once again, and that's going to keep pressures moving lower. Then when you start looking at the market and how we see things kind of shifting, it's interesting when you look at what powered the world in 2022. Coal continues to have the highest component of it. Natural gas is taking more and more of that coal share. But, it's important to look at renewables on the wind, solar, and other, which is the biomass. Obviously, we file hydroelectric into that. But it's unfortunate to see nuclear seeing a decline because of its importance in the baseload structure. We've seen coal actually increase, and it's all because people are going to do what's available. And our view is we have to make natural gas and LNG more available, nuclear more available, and that will help, create that basket approach, because there are places that coal makes sense, especially if you can have, the offsets that we can create. But it's funny because when you start looking at the credit market, and the issuance of carbon credits is minute next to the volume of emissions, and it's one of the things where we do think the focal point is to increase liquidity of credits, which is going to be a big push going forward, and something that, at the C6 level on the PE side, we are looking to take advantage of, because all the projects that we're in do yield some sort of either carbon offset or carbon credit. So that's where we have for you on the global side. In the next segment, we're going to go deeper into the U.S. and kind of how things are shaping up now that we've had the commentary from Powell, what he's signaling in terms of that Fed staying on hold with future hikes likely on the table.